All right, good afternoon. This is the Civics lecture for Monday, May 4th. We're going to do two of them today, and we're going to be moving from political parties to campaigns and elections. So kind of similar but different, uh, particularly because, obviously political parties are organized to control and capture the government, and in a democracy, a representative system, elections are the primary means that they do that. But of course, political parties are involved in more than just acquiring office, which is the first step, but they also organize governmental institutions, they produce policy, they organize voters, they send messages. And so there's some similarities, but also some differences between political parties and campaigns elections. In some ways, what I would say is that political parties are a more comprehensive kind of institution. Campaigns and elections are much more of a means to an end as far as that's concerned. But in campaigns and elections, political parties actually have some pretty significant competition in terms of how they are looked at, in terms of the roles they play in this whole idea of running for office and all of that. So bit different, but also bit of the same in terms of these two institutions that we're looking at. And the kind of overarching theme that we've been trying to develop with these two is that it's hard to imagine having a republic without political parties, and it's very difficult to imagine a republic without campaigns and elections. And the two are kind of tied at the hip. If you think of political parties as kind of brokers or middlemen between the voter and the elected official, campaigns and elections also kind of function in that kind of middleman role, because the idea of having a republic, as opposed to some system where people are selected for governance in a different way, whether it's through birth or through power or through military coups or whatever it might be. We as Americans believe that the best way to peacefully transfer power from one faction to another is through elections. And in a large degree, there's a lot to critique about how we conduct elections, and we'll talk about that. But the fact that we still have a system that most people in our country honor, respect, abide by is a huge deal, because we just take it for granted that every 2, 4, 6 years, ordinary people go to the ballot box and choose our leaders. And then the losers go home and maybe try again later, but they don't stop what they're doing and not abide by the results or of that particular election. So that's something we should not overlook. This idea that part of our political culture is respecting the results of campaigns and elections. And to the extent that we don't, and I think that I'm getting a sense in the last couple of election cycles that there's an increasing number of people on both sides of the political aisle that are not terribly comfortable with abiding by the results. Now, there hasn't been armed rebellion, but there has been soft rebellion. I would argue that the last 3.5 years of the Trump administration, there has been a pretty powerful element within the Democratic Party that just basically does not recognize the legitimacy of the person who was elected as president. But that is about the same as the Republican Party during the Obama administration. There was a pretty powerful constituency that probably did not recognize that person as the legitimate president. Now, there were different circumstances surrounding the feelings about that, but if that continues over time, that is a very foreboding development, something that you need to keep an eye on, and it's not healthy for our country. Okay, so that's a little bit by way of background, I guess. What we're going to try to do today is we're going to look at a few other big issues with campaigns and elections in terms of the purposes that they're supposed to perform. Then we're going to kind of really narrow down and kind of drill down in terms of the difference between presidential and congressional campaigns. So there's a campaign element and an election element. The campaigns are organizations that are designed around candidates to win a particular office. And the word campaign actually comes from the military. Armies who were fighting each other in a long, protracted war would go on particular types of campaigns and in different theaters of operation. So a campaign was a strategy, a military strategy that would say, okay, we're going to, the Athenians are going to defeat the Spartans by doing, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, okay, or the United States Army is going to defeat the German Nazi army by doing these three things. And so you develop a kind of strategy where you're going to move from place to place to place and confront an enemy, have a fight, and then see who prevails. And so that kind of military jargon fills presidential and congressional politics because it really is a fight. But again, we hope, a peaceful fight, a fight with ballots, not bullets. So campaigns are the mechanism, the organizations that candidates for presidency and Congress organize and establish and set up in order to help them win office. And as we talked about with political parties play an important role in helping and developing those campaigns. And I would argue that in the 19th century, they were much more like the primary way of organizing campaigns. And they were making decisions not only about how the campaigns were run, but also who would run in the first place. So part of discussions about campaigns has to do with candidates themselves and why somebody actually becomes a candidate in the first place. So we're going to look at campaigns, both presidential and congressional, in terms of their organizational structure and what's some of the kind of factors that influence those. And then we're going to look beginning at elections, and we're going to look at primary elections. So there's a difference between the primary stage of an election and the general election stage of an election. So we will look at both of those from the prism of president and then Congress. So that's kind of the idea. So we're going to look at campaigns, presidential and congressional, and then we're going to start looking at elections, presidential and congressional. And the next lecture for today, we're going to actually really drill down in terms of the presidential system of the map, so to speak, of the general election for the presidency. And on RenWeb, I've given you some cool links that I would encourage you to kind of check out. There's a U.S. election atlas that shows election results for the presidency all the way back to the first one. And then there's another website that shows presidential campaign commercials since the first one, television commercials really from the Eisenhower campaign in 1952 to the present. Okay, because another thing that we'll be pointing out is that campaigns and elections are dominated by media because that's one of the primary ways that they end up trying to communicate to voters. Give me 1 second here. Oops, sorry. Oops. Gotcha. All right. Come here. It's okay. You want to go out? All right, sorry about that. That was not smooth. Okay. One big issue, one big broad issue, I think, with campaigns and elections has to do with whether they fulfill the goal of democracy. And it bears repeating, I think, that the only way that having a representative democracy makes sense is if there's a real kind of connection between the voter and the elected official. And that's where the whole accountability aspect comes into it. So if candidates and elected officials aren't interested in voters, which some people might say is the case, and on the flip side, if voters aren't really interested in candidates, the decline in voter turnout, people just kind of not really being interested in following the campaigns and all of the rest, then, you know, is this a good system? Because you could argue that maybe there's a better way of determining who our leaders are if both the leaders and the voters are disconnected from one another. And so one question I think we should keep in mind is what makes for a good election? Good in parentheses. Well, good could mean several things. One, does an election satisfy that basic criteria that voters are allowed to render judgment on the people that are governing them? Because in a representative system, we don't want everyday people to be making everyday decisions, because it's a big country, we have a big society, and there's more to do than just pass laws. In fact, most people should not be passing laws because there's all sorts of more important things to be doing. So if that's the system we want, then there has to be this engagement on the part of both sides. And if that has broken down, so a good election would be something where I would argue that the voters know in broad brushstrokes, and this is where political parties might come in, because political parties function as a cue and as a guide of identifying, like a product, what a particular candidate stands for. So if, just like, let's say the Democratic Party is the Coca-Cola Party and the Republican Party is the Pepsi Party, knowing the differences between Coke and Pepsi or Republican and Democrat, well, it would help somebody make an informed choice. And that's what we want. We want voters not to go in and guess or base their decisions on personality or hair color or some other thing that just doesn't really matter, how gruff they are or what kind of husband or wife they are or something like that. Now, character obviously plays a role in making these kinds of decisions, but you get the point. I mean, we're voting for a politician and not someone you want to marry. So that good election would be something where the voter has a general idea of where the candidates stand. Now, how does that happen? Another part of being a good election is that the candidates have the capacity to inform the voter where they stand. Now, from the candidate perspective, the whole reason for them to engage in this activity is to win. And so for them, winning the office is the goal. And and the broader goal might be to serve your country, to maybe pass good laws that'll help citizens, and that really would be kind of the overarching goal of somebody running for office. But you can't do any good unless you have the seat, unless you have the office. And so from the candidate perspective, they need to win. And so, they're not going to say everything about who they are, because there might be some things about them and their positions on issues or their character or whatever that might not help them win. And that doesn't mean that they're hiding anything. It's just that you have to make choices about what you're going to present to the public in order to get one more vote than the other person to win the office. So a good election from the voter standpoint is that they have enough information about the candidates to make an informed choice. Now, where are they getting that information from? It could be from the candidates themselves, but you also have to remember that the candidate, just like I said, is not, he wants to win, she wants to win. It's not in their interest to tell you everything about them. What there is in their interest is to tell them to be honest, not to lie, but to craft a message, craft a set of priorities that can win. And so the candidate, from the perspective of the candidate, a good election is one where they are actually able to have enough resources to be able to communicate to the voters effectively. Now, if I'm a voter, I'm not just going to take it from the word of the candidate about where they stand. I want to do my own research. I'm going to have an idea about where the parties stand on issues, and I'm going to do my homework. And I'm not just going to rely on the candidates themselves, but from the candidate perspective, I need enough resources to make that pitch. And so the issue of money is a big deal in campaigns and elections. And as a result, there's all sorts of ideas and proposals out there to, in some respects, reduce the amount of influence that money plays. And I think that just like if you were running a sports league and you allow the New York Yankees, which to some respects we kind of do, to have $50 million to organize a team, and then everybody else has $2 million to run a team. Well, who's going to get the best players? The New York Yankees are going to, and they're going to have a better chance of winning. And so, just like with sports, you want to create a system in campaigns, elections, if it's a competition, of creating a fair playing field within which to compete. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't within some kind of broad parameter allow differences among teams and candidates and all of that to actually, if I really want to be on a school board and I want to spend $10,000 of my own money to get it, then maybe that should be the way it should be. And then if another candidate doesn't really want that, only pays $1,000, well, that's your priority. Okay, so what am I trying to say? What I'm trying to say is that money, you need enough of it to communicate to the voter. So that's what it means to have a good election, is to be able to have that communication. But if it's too much or it's misallocated and there's too much in one hand and not in another, you worry about that the competition is going to be unfair. And then, are elections a fair barometer of where the people stand on issues, or is it more of a fair barometer of the ability of certain people, certain parties, certain factions, certain interest groups of distorting the system and having it work for their own interests as opposed to the interests of the entire country? So this is a big deal about how we run our campaigns and elections. And so on the one hand, I think some people say, oh, we should get money out of politics. Well, not all money, because you need resources to communicate to voters. If you didn't have those resources, then how would you know where people stand on issues? And then it would be more up to you about how to go about doing that, and maybe people don't have the time or the effort or the inclination to want to do that, and then the system breaks down for another reason. And I think all of these issues are kind of live ones right now, because I think there's a kind of a double-edged sword where I think there's a lot of discontent and cynicism about politicians and politics in general, but also a large amount of lack of interest, to put it mildly. That basically there's a disengagement that's going on, and both of them are not healthy for the system. And so with money, another big question is who controls elections, right? So that's kind of all these things we need to keep in mind as we proceed. All right, so let's look at presidential versus congressional campaigns. I did allow, there is a chapter on campaigns, elections that I'd ask you to skim, but primarily you just need to listen to my lecture to find out the most important things. So there's differences between congressional and presidential campaigns. I'll just go over a few of them for you. One is how competitive are these elections? I think the founders thought that the most competitive elections would be the ones that would be kind of closest to the people and with a smaller kind of terms of debate and the number of people participating. And so, if you looked at it from national, state, probably state legislatures and city councils would be very competitive. And then, the more you removed the people from the process of picking, that would become less competitive and more of a kind of a elite selection process. So I think what they thought was that Congress would be more competitive than the presidency. That has not proven to be the case over time. And actually right now, if you look at the margin of victory for congressional elections versus presidential elections are just much closer today. Really starting with 1988, there's been very few presidents who've actually won with more than 50% of the popular vote. And even though maybe the Electoral College, it's a little bit more of a majority, the popular vote margin of victory is very, very low, usually below 55% for somebody winning the presidency. Where if you look at a congressional election, you're talking about results where a lot of candidates are winning 60, 70% of the election. So presidential elections are more competitive. There's also higher turnout with presidential elections versus congressional, more interest, more media attention, more focus. Now, in the case of congressional elections, there's part of this too is that the presidency is term limited, so you can only have 2 terms as the president. So you're you know at least every 8 years you're going to have what we call an open seat. And open seat elections are very, very different beasts than what I call closed seat elections or elections with an incumbent. Incumbency confers a huge advantage on who's going to win that election. Now, some people think that's unfair. We'll talk about that in a second. But incumbency matters, and it matters in terms of who wins and loses. And it might be the case that we want incumbents to win because maybe they're more experienced, they know the job, they're doing a good job for their constituents. Why wouldn't you want to return somebody to office? Others would argue that incumbency sets up a situation where maybe people are unfairly powerful and that they discourage competition, almost like in terms of a monopoly. And then just the overall focus of the country is much more kind of obsessed with the presidency in general and presidential elections in particular. So every 4 years, it's just a different beast. Turnout's much lower. We call them off-year elections. These are elections where, when the presidency is not up for grabs, because House every 2 years for the House of Representatives, and then for the Senate, a third of their body is up every 2 years. So in an off-year election, you have a very different set of voters that vote. The highest we've had in terms of overall turnout. This is the percentage of people who can vote, obviously over 18 and all of that, and who can vote, who do. And so I think in 2008 we got over 60% for the first time since 1960, and I don't think that the 2016 got above 60, but it was in the high 50s. Those are high for modern American politics. Most presidential elections recently have been under 50% in terms of turnout. And if you look at congressional off-year elections, you're talking about, maybe a third of the eligible voters actually voting. And so some people would argue that maybe that's a problem in and of itself, that less people are voting. Therefore, we ought to increase the ease with it. And we're seeing this with the coronavirus. There's all these proposals. Well, we should allow people to vote by mail. And maybe not just temporarily. Maybe this becomes the new normal, right? I for one, would bemoan that. I don't think that would be a good idea. I can see it maybe if there was some kind of pandemic or some major health problem or something like that, but that would be a temporary thing. I think it would be a huge shame to get rid of same-day voting. Now, with that, some people might argue that in order to increase voter turnout, you could change the day to Saturday, so it's not a work day. Others would say, well, if it's a weekend, most people go out of town or do other things with the family, that maybe voter turnout would go down. Okay. Then there's voter registration, which is different than voting. You got to register to vote in order to vote. Some people would say make that easier. Maybe have same day. I think in Minnesota you can register and vote on the same day. And then there's issues about whether that is encourages corruption and voter fraud and all of the rest. The point is turnout is much lower among congressional elections, and even when the presidency is on the ballot, so you're going to have all of the House and a third of the Senate up then, and depending on let's say you're a Senate incumbent, there might be 1 year where you're running when the president is running, so there's higher turnout for you, and then maybe you run for the election the next time around, and it's an off-year election. Well, different types of voters are going to look at you, whether it's a presidential election season or a non-presidential election season. So that has to do with just the amount of focus that is on your election in the first place. All right, let's look at presidential campaigns really quickly. Um, one issue to think about just right off the top of our heads is who runs, who decides to run for office in the first place, and increasingly this is a concern that I have in particular, is that uh, it's incredibly expensive to run for president. You're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, one thing, a lot of people say, "Oh my gosh, that's too much money to run for president." Now, if you compare how much money Anheuser-Busch pays to promote beer and for people to buy beer in our economy, and you compare it to how much money we spend on politicians, and I'm not just talking about just the presidency. I'm talking about if you add up all of the money that is spent in the primary and general election for House, Senate, President, local, state, federal, and every 4 years, that whole amount is less than the advertising budget of the beer industry in the United States. Just the beer industry. Imagine other industries. So I don't get too nervous about that, only because now I think the quality of these ads and the quality of the information, that's a huge problem. But the fact that we're spending money on informing people about our politicians, that's not a bad thing. It's just that maybe the type of communication is bad. But communicating in general, I don't have such a problem with it. And I don't really have such a problem with using the media. It's just that how do you use it, and can you use it in a way that actually elevates the discussion or gets it into the gutter? Or not just the gutter, so-called negative or attack ads, but also just issues that don't matter. It matters of personality as opposed to, where you stand on the big issues of the day. But a lot of people who aren't informed, they gravitate toward the personality questions. I think there's no doubt that is a circumstance surrounding our current occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. It's almost like he's so controversial that people just don't even listen to what he has to say, or if they do, they're only listening for their own purposes. So, who runs for president? Somebody who can raise a heck of a lot of money. Now, who is that? Typically, it has been people who have already served in office. So we're talking about senators, governors. The senators. I mean, if you look at the Democrats who ran for the presidency this time around, how many of them were in the Senate? You had Warren, you had Sanders. Buttigieg was interesting because he wasn't a senator, right? And he was actually making a lot about that in his campaign. Klobuchar. Biden was the ex-vice president, but he was also, for most of his career, an ex-senator, so you could probably throw him in the mix. So Senate, a lot of people. Governors, there has been kind of more of a trend among, I would say, Republicans to, Obama was a senator, too. Kerry was a senator. So the Democrats have tended to go toward the Senate, I think, recently. For the Republicans, you look at Reagan, governor, George W. Bush, governor, Romney, governor. Now he's in the Senate, but he was the governor primarily at the beginning. So it's a mixed bag. I would tend to say if I was drawing trend lines, Republicans tend to nominate governors, Democrats, senators. But increasingly now, and we'll see if this happens. Trump was nothing. He was not. He didn't hold the first office that he ever held was president. That is rather unique. Now, Eisenhower was an example of that. He had never held elective office before. He became president. So sometimes military leaders have that distinction. Grant was an example of that. Now, Washington, he had held legislative office in the colonial government. So he actually had held office before he was a general and then the president of the United States. Jackson, even though he's primarily considered a war hero, he would be considered somebody. I mean, he was a House member, a senator, and I think he might have even been governor. So he held a lot of positions before he became president. So there's kind of a stepping stone approach. But I think because now we're going to talk about money later in the week, but the Supreme Court ruled that actually Congress can limit the amount of money individuals can donate to particular campaigns. With the idea that even though they look at donating to office as a form of free speech, okay? And so because political contributions are, your right to associate, your right to speak your mind, and to influence the course of elections, they believe that's kind of part and parcel of democracy. And so the court has ruled that it's okay for Congress to limit how much you can give as long as you can give something. So they've limited how much individuals can give, I think, to $2,000 in the primary and the general election for House, Senate, and President. What we call political action committees, PACs. These are interest group organizations. They have to form a political action committee, register with the Federal Election Commission. And the idea there is transparency, that so let's say it's the pro NARAL, National Abortion Rights Action League. They have a PAC. They give money to candidates. They want to promote their particular views on abortion, pregnancy, pregnancy planning, all that kind of child care, daycare. They actually have a pretty wide variety of issues that they stand for. Anyway, the point is, they can raise money. There's limits on how much you can give to a PAC, and then there's a limit on how much the PAC can give to a particular individual candidate. All of that is constitutional, and all of that is designed to create that kind of level playing field that I was discussing before. But in the same case, this is Buckley versus Vallejo, I think 1973. In the same case, the Supreme Court said that actually Congress could not limit how much Rich Brake could pay for Rich Brake's campaign. So there are no limits, and the Congress had attempted to do that. And they said that that is different, that you can basically control your own self, and you can pay however much you want. And so that has created kind of an incentive for independently wealthy people increasingly to run for office so they can get around. Because what ends up happening is that if you accept these constraints on spending, particularly in the primary election, then there are certain spending limits that also go on. So there's contribution limits and there's spending limits on this money. Again, we'll talk more about this later. What's my bottom line? The bottom line is that there was these laws were put on the books to restrict big corporations and labor unions and other interest groups to have a disproportionate influence on campaigns and elections. And to a large degree, they have. The biggest problem, I would argue, especially for congressional elections and campaigns, is that it's just the money chase in and of itself. That you can get money on both sides of the issues, depending on where you stand. It's just you need enough money to pay. And how do most people communicate with voters? It's through the media. So this is a massive transfer payment from individuals and corporate and organizations through the candidates. And what do the candidates do? They sign checks to the TV stations. And it's every 2, 4, 6 years, there's massive amounts of money that go into these media conglomerates because they're the ones that are, that's how candidates are communicating with voters. So what was the point there? The point was increasingly I'm seeing that with presidential campaigns that somebody like a Trump or like a Bloomberg, they don't have to abide by the limits and they can spend however much they want. And so if that creates a situation where the only people who are really going to run for president are independently wealthy megalomaniacs, I don't think that's a good trend. In terms of organizations, a typical campaign, they're going to have a campaign manager, they're going to have a finance chairman who's in charge of raising money. A big post is press secretary. This is somebody who's interacting with the media. You also have field offices in different states. You have on-the-ground workers, media personalities, political consultants. Political parties get involved with it. So it's a large operation, and they're campaigning whether it's if it's the presidency from state to state, if it's Congress, it's within a particular state, if it's a Senate, or if it's a district, different parts. In the case of the district in Petoskey, you're talking about maybe traveling to Traverse City, but all the way up to the UP. Okay, campaigns are going to develop strategies and themes. You can't go in assuming that you're going to win every vote. So you have to target, and you have to say, okay, how many people can I appeal to with a limited amount of money in order to get one more vote than the other person? And so you're going to target your resources wisely, or at least you try to. And you're going to develop certain themes, bumper stickers. See these campaign buttons and all of the rest. But you're also, think about MAGA, Make America Great Again. That's a slogan. And the first slogans were actually Tippecanoe and Tyler too. This was William Henry Harrison from Indiana was running with Tyler from Virginia on the Whig ticket, and they ended up winning the election in 1840. And then I think William Henry Harrison dies 6 months later because he caught a cold and died. But anyway, sloganeering, but that "Make America Great" theme has been effective for Trump, right? There's hats and merchandise, and so in some ways, a candidate, it's almost like selling a product. You have commercials, you have different ways of kind of boiling down your point to a couple of major themes. So that happens, and then there's also in this the whole idea about running for office or developing a campaign is that are you an insider or an outsider? It's easier, obviously, if you are running as for a first-time candidate to run as an outsider. But once you're in office, it's harder to do that. So you're going to run on terms of your experience and your ability to serve your constituents well, so on and so forth. But for the presidency, obviously Trump, and both Trump and Sanders in 2016 ran as outsiders. Now, Trump is an insider, but is he? Maybe he's uncomfortable being an insider. Maybe he's better at campaigning than actually running the government. And he's not the only one that could be put into that circumstance. I think increasingly the talents and skills you need to win elections have become completely disengaged from what the skills you need to actually run the executive branch. And that is a big, big problem for us. In terms of congressional, and one of the things it looks like, how much time do I have left? Yeah, we've got about 8 more minutes. So I'm not getting as far as I thought I would. So we're going to probably end up with congressional campaigns, and then the next lecture for Monday we'll talk about primary elections and congressional, presidential primaries and congressional primaries. We'll get to that the next class. So that will be what we do on Monday. So anyway, with congressional campaigns, one of the biggest, obviously you still have this big question about who runs and who decides to run. And a lot of that has to do, with the size and shape of the district, especially obviously with the House of Representatives. For the Senate, you're running by state. And so the shape of Michigan isn't going to change, right? But the shape of congressional districts change every 10 years with the census, and then the state legislature redraws district lines, and we call that redistricting. So one of the biggest incentives or factors that influence the incentive to run for Congress or not is whether the district is if the district has voters that that you have an appeal to. And this gets back to kind of what makes elections good. If you take a page out of economics, we believe that in a market system, competition makes prices go down and the quality of products go up. If it's a monopoly, prices go up and quality goes down. Well, you can look at it in the same way with political parties. Are there monopolies in these congressional districts? And so what has happened over time, and we call it gerrymandering because it's named after Elbridge Gerry, who was a congressman from Massachusetts at the founding, and the state legislature of Massachusetts drew a district line that favored Elbridge Gerry because it kind of snaked around and salamandered around different communities in the Boston area to help him because these areas were more Federalist than Jeffersonian Republican. Well, it looked like a salamander. And so the newspaper man said, "Oh my gosh, they gerrymandered the district," because Elbridge Gerry was the last name. So it was kind of a pun in some respects. So gerrymandering means drawing district lines to favor one party over another, and this is a big problem. Most House districts are disproportionately one party over another, to the point where if you have 435 House districts, which we do, the average number of House campaigns, so we're talking about elections in the general election, where the margin of victory is below 55%, 45%. So that's what, 10 percentage points, which is actually a pretty decisive victory. But the number of seats that are at least 55, 45 or lower, 53, 47, 52, 48, 51, 49, there's only, on average, every 2 years, 30 to 40 seats that are quote unquote competitive. What that means is that most districts are drawn in a way, because now we know pretty sure, like, urban areas are more Democratic, rural areas are more Republican. And so state legislators know this, and they're members of political parties. And so they draw these lines in a way to make it easier for the Democrats in urban areas to win and Republicans to win in rural areas. And then the few districts that are actually competitive are typically ones in the suburbs where there's more of an equal split between Republicans and Democrats. So that has a big impact on whether it's a safe seat or a competitive seat. The other thing that makes it safe or competitive is whether an incumbent is running or whether it's an open seat. When an incumbent is running, it's over 90% chance that the incumbent will win. That's because they have advantages in fundraising, they have advantages particularly in name recognition, and so on and so forth. And so now, whether that's a problem or not, I think that's up to debate. I think it's probably, there's a little bit too much that's made out of it, but I get the point. Open seats are more competitive, but the way these lines are drawn are very, very problematic. And so actually, just like they thought that House districts would be more competitive than Senate, and Senate more competitive than the presidency, it's almost the opposite. It's actually Senate elections are more competitive than House, and presidential more competitive than Senate in terms of how close these elections are. And I would argue that you want a fair playing field. Now look, if one party is better at providing issues and satisfying the needs of constituents, then they should win, and maybe they win by a large margin. But over the course of time, you want competitive elections. That's good for voters. That keeps the parties on track, and it makes them kind of be more desirous of appealing to the voter. And if that's what democracy is, unless you don't trust the voters, you want constituents, politicians, to attend to the needs of the constituents. Now, just like we talked about with Congress, there's the trustee and delegate version of how you represent those interests, but it's a delicate balancing act, isn't it? Okay, so incumbency is a huge factor in terms of whether you will decide to run for office or not. Incumbents who decide to run for re-election have over 85% over the past 50 years of winning. Now, not every time an incumbent will run for re-election. Sometimes they get tired of it. I think the average tenure of a House member is about 8 years right now, so that's about 4 terms. So that means that on average, people are getting out after 4 or 5 terms. Maybe they run for another office, maybe they decide to go back to the private sector, maybe they die, maybe they get old, I don't know, right? And so what we find is that every 10 years, there's actually a higher than normal retirement rate. And that has a lot to do with redistricting. And so if you are representing a district and your district changes, and maybe now you have more voters from the rival party, that might affect your decision to actually run for office. Now, so why and when to run is a big deal. Who runs? We tend to. I think we talked about this with Congress. Lawyers, business people, increasingly entertainers, school teachers. So those are some typical kind of backgrounds for running for Congress. But it's more about when do you time your run. If you got to raise a little bit less than $1 million to be competitive in a House race, then you're not going to do that if you're going up against a popular incumbent. And so what we see is that politicians can kind of sense where the winds are blowing and whether an election season is going to be more favorable to one party or another. And so sometimes people time, good politicians, good candidates are going to time their decision to run to maximize their ability to win. Open seats do that, and also trends and macroeconomic trends. I don't know how this coronavirus is going to impact. Will it hurt Republicans, help Republicans, hurt Democrats, help Democrats? I don't know. It's probably a little bit too early to say. It was probably setting up where, with a strong economy, Trump was going to have a better than chance of actually winning re-election. Now things are a little bit more uncertain, I would say. So we'll see. Same way with members of Congress. So this will have to play out. In terms of campaign organization, same type of things for Congress. You're going to have a campaign manager, press secretary, scheduler, advance people. I forgot to tell you about that. Those are people who go to the next event to organize it. Media consultants developing television, radio ads, now online, internet ads, Twitter, Facebook. These are all becoming mechanisms by which candidates use to run for office for Congress. So that's a little bit of some down and dirty in terms of presidential and congressional campaigns. I think that we'll stop there, and the next lecture we'll look at elections and look at primary elections for president and then Congress, and then we'll kind of do a little bit of a preview for the general election phase, right? Particularly for president, because that's the most interesting, I think. So we'll finish up primaries today in the next lecture. Then we'll do general election on Wednesday, and then on Thursday with our live class, I'll go over some stuff on campaign finance reform and money, and then we can have a kind of a live discussion about that. Okay, so that'll be the plan of attack. Thank you.